Your seats. We are gonna just walk into the later segment of today. For those of you who have not met me before, my name is Federica Pazzaglia. I'm a director of the Swerfit School. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here today for our second Impact Maker Summit. And I'm counting on you having had a very stimulating and very interesting, I've heard the word provocative before, which is always a word I hear very happily. So I thought that the day so far has delivered on what you were expecting. I'm here to introduce the keynote speaker, and it is my great pleasure to introduce Tina Fordham, who will address the timely and very interesting, as you will remember, it's been a silver lining of a lot of the discussions today, topic of geopolitical outlook, seismic change. Tina is an internationally recognized geostrategist, author, and advisor to boards and C-suite leaders, navigating an increasingly complex and rapidly challenging global environment. Widely regarded as Wall Street's original Chief Global Political Analyst, she spent 17 years at Citigroup and also established Eurasia Group financial markets research business. Her distinguished career has included appointments to the United Nations' first high-level panel on women economic empowerment, as well as serving as senior advisor to the UK Prime Minister. Tina is also a member of the International Advisory Boards of Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs, her alma mater, and Cambridge University Center for Geopolitics. In addition, she hosts The Navigator, producing collaboration with the London Stock Exchange, and a frequent commentator on CNN, CNBC, and Bloomberg. Her forthcoming book, Mad World, a Geostrategy Survival Guide for Leaders, will be published in July 2026. Please join me in welcoming Tina Fordham. Thank you.
Well, nothing like a soothing title to focus minds to start with. I'm very glad that I was here for the opening session where there was a discussion about geopolitics and some interesting debate with the ambassadors about sort of what kind of era we're in, and the dean as well. And I'd like to set expectations now by saying I'm going to gently but forcefully tear apart a fair amount of what was said, but I will back it up with data. So I'm Tina Fordham, and you're going to have to start out not focusing on my accent. I know this is hard, and I'll tell you why as we go along. I am originally from the US. I've been living in London for 24 years, and before that, lived in lots of other places. So you're just going to have to get to grips with that kind of global person from nowhere kind of worldview. I know this is hard. Every day of my life in the UK, I'm asked how long I'm here for. But 2 weeks ago in Washington, I was asked, what part of England are you from? So that's the world we're living in. I brought the notes that I took during that first session just to remind myself. But before we dig in, how great is it that UCD has brought everybody together for this kind of discussion? I mean, the power of networks and human exchange, I think, whether you are an AI optimist or pessimist, I think has never been more powerful. So I think a big hats off to the team for doing that and really focusing in on the themes that everybody needs to know about. Whether you are a business leader, a political leader, a citizen, a student, a member of your community, my starting point is that it is a luxury good and a relic of another time that you don't need to think about the global context that you're living in. So with that in mind, we're going to go through the geostrategy outlook. There's lots of time for questions or observations, but seismic change is where we start. Now, I asked this question before every audience. We're going to do it by a show of hands. It is a fantastic barometer for how you see the world as it is now relative to your own experience. I asked this question in Bucharest, Romania on Thursday, and we're going to compare how people in this room see the world. Is it worse than it's ever been or better than it's ever been, in your view? How many people think the world is better now than it's ever been? Which is very unscientific. Find the whole middle of the room is either pessimistic or shy. We will find out how many people think the world is worse now than it's ever been. Again, there's no right answer, no wrong answer, although we could collect data to support either of them. What your answer to this question tells me and should tell you is about your expectations for how things should be. Now, I'm a political scientist, but I'll borrow from economists who have an equation that says that happiness equals expectations minus reality. Right? Keep that with you because it's quite a useful construct. So if you thought things were going to turn out much better than they have and they haven't, you're going to think the world is worse. You're probably not going to think about data that I do when I look at this question, like health and mortality indicators or lifespan or access to clean water or literacy rates or crime or anything else. Most people answer this question based on the way they feel about their own circumstances. And I would argue, as I do when I'm talking to corporate leaders in whether it's fast-moving consumer goods or just for a random example, executive education programs or whatever it might be, that our appetite for learning new things, for taking more risk, is partly a function of the way we address this question. So we're here to talk about geopolitics, but what I've learned after more than 25 years of really focusing on this intersection between geopolitics, financial markets, and the business environment is there are some rooms where no matter how thoughtful my presentation is or how much work I've done analyzing the data, some people just aren't buying it. And that's because of cognitive bias. Not everybody would go to a business school and wheel out a quote from Vladimir Lenin, but in 2025, this felt like a really useful one, and a lot of people felt that it resonated with them. This idea that it feels like the pace of change is more rapid than ever before. Well, not ever before, because when Lenin said it, the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire were all collapsing at the same time. And of course, we were on the eve of World War I in Europe with untold changes in human populations and everything else. So as rapid as it feels like, it's not like it was when Lenin said this. But I think for most of us, relative to the way we think about things when we were younger, it does feel like change is happening more rapidly, and we can't keep up. I think partly that's technology, as well as other factors. Now, people have different reactions to this. Some is to become news avoiders, or just to kind of ignore what's going on. Others maybe want to get ahead of the curve. You may be in one camp or the other, but I hope by the end of this you'll understand also the difference between keeping up with news and current events and mentally preparing for a more complex global environment. So starting with 2026, I like to say that 2025 was kind of the wake-up call when it comes to how geopolitics really entered at least the corporate vocabulary in a way that we weren't used to. We had the Venezuela extraction operation, which saw President Maduro unceremoniously removed from his home in Caracas in his pajamas and now in a New York City district courtroom. That operation went so well, in President Trump's mind anyway, that he thought he'd try it again in Iran, where it's gone less well, and we are 9 weeks into a war in Iran. And of course, in between, for us in Europe, there was the tremendous wake-up call, I would say, of the Greenland offer of annexation. You know, I'm not as diplomatic as the actual diplomats that you had on screen, but whether, you know, President Trump likes to alternate between full-blown threats to, you know, buying Greenland or something else. Between the Venezuela operation and the Greenland annexation offer, the Iran war, and then the kind of big geopolitical risks that we've been contending with, which is the Russia-Ukraine war since 2022, and the kind of the big one in geopolitics terms has always been whether China would make a move on Taiwan. We've got all of these, you know, geopolitical risk factors inflamed at one time. Now, does this matter? Does this affect your life? You might say no. Certainly last week there was a very interesting headline from the Milk and Global Institute conference that was reported on in the FT, unattributed, but the FT reported that an American banker said, "Who cares whether the Strait of Hormuz is open or not?" Well, Americans really aren't affected by this. I was in Washington 2 weeks ago at the Semaphore CEO Summit, and if you are a C-suite leader, I highly recommend attending that. All of the great and the good were there. It's going to be a real rival to Davos. But the most striking impression that I had, and all of the other people who had traveled from outside the US to be there, was the tremendous disconnect between the perception of American business leaders and kind of everyone else. And that also came through to me from the ambassador's remarks in the opening panel. It matters to us a lot if the Strait of Hormuz is open, because Europe and Asia, as well as Africa for fertilizer and other commodities, we're very dependent upon that traffic going through the strait. Now, the energy shock hasn't landed yet, but you know, America has shale gas and U.S. energy independence, and 80% of the global equities market is U.S. companies, and we all know about the Magnificent Seven. So that insulates America from many of these geopolitical risks, although I would argue not forever. The thing to look for is, how does it affect our currencies? How does it affect global growth? We're probably not near a recession yet. If you're in the commodities business, this very, very much has an impact. And, you know, one American senator at the Semaphore conference said that the United States had done a jujitsu move, he said. I don't know jujitsu, so can't verify whether it was jujitsu or not. But his point was that by, quote, taking out China's two cheap sources of energy, Venezuela and Iran, in fact, what Washington had done was this jujitsu move against China. We are about to find out because President Trump and Xi Jinping are meeting on Thursday and Friday. But what I'm trying to do here with these puzzle pieces and the economic context is to make an explicit connection between what you might be tempted to dismiss as news headlines or Donald Trump doing crazy things. I mean, I leave that to you to decide, but they do have an impact on our lives and our businesses and Ireland and its national strategy and everything else, and we just can't ignore it. So, who cares about geopolitics? For as long as I can remember, I was brought into corporate boardrooms and investor conferences and asked very specific questions about very specific topics. And what that tells you is that there was a sense that geopolitics was on the sidelines, not central to corporate strategy, hotspots or black swans, kinds of, economists use the term negative externalities. Accountants, of course, if you corporate finance background, think about all risks as either a 0 or a 1. They either aren't going to happen or they are going to happen. The problem with geopolitics is it's probability driven, there are cumulative probabilities, and that doesn't help you assess those risks for your company. So we need another system for that. But for sure, companies are talking about geopolitics, certainly in their company documents, their annual reports. I haven't tracked it down yet, but a close second now to terms being used a lot in company reports is resilience. Resilience, of course, being the favored corporate buzzword in response to these developments. My point is that this is new, and this is a change in trend. I put the US business leaders number on here, 84% worried about the political and legal climate, because it's a politically neutral question, right? No one asked, do you think Donald Trump is good or bad for your company? Which would have given you a very predictable answer, straight along party lines. This, to me, is an insight into the way that however corporate America might be lining up behind the White House agenda officially, and certainly getting on that plane to Beijing, very interesting to see which companies are going there, they're concerned about institutional independence, rule of law, and everything else in a big way. These numbers are all dramatic increases. But look at that 92% number. This comes from a McKinsey report that talked about what to do about it. I think this is a great segue into the rest of the conversation, which is adaptability and open-mindedness. It doesn't mean keep doing what you've always been doing and you'll be proved right in the end. I mentioned this already after realizing, after many, many years, that most people think geopolitics and news are the same thing. So therefore, if you've got a board meeting, and this is a universal behavior, you spend 30 minutes reading the Financial Times before, and you're up to date on geopolitics. If you have a business meeting, you might read the first 10 pages of The Economist. If you don't do either of those things, it's okay, you can catch up. But what you're doing is keeping up with news flow and current affairs. Geopolitics is what countries do to project power beyond their borders. If that's the only thing you remember from my remarks, I'll be happy. Because what we are seeing at the moment is mainly superpowers, but not only, trying to change the rules of the game and the rules of engagement by projecting power across their borders in new and different ways, testing the waters to see what happens. Now, most investors, and anyone, I presume, who is a graduate of this fine institution, will be familiar with the concept of mean reversion. Mean reversion has worked very well for a long time. And this is why the number one question I get in boardrooms is, when are things going back to normal? People don't normally ask that out loud, but in private conversations, what they really want to know is, or as one private equity portco said to me at a private equity event, you'll forgive my language, won't you? He said, do I really have to care about this shit? What was interesting, by the way, was the reaction of his colleagues who piled in on him. This is all in my book, by the way, if you thought that was funny. But this, I think, human kind of urge to look at any sort of crisis, challenge, turmoil, this too shall pass. Yes. However, it doesn't mean that things are going to go back, right? because we don't have a time machine. The other thing that I observed in thousands of conversations is what people mean when they say normal. I mean, it means different things to different people, but what they really mean is before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, before the pandemic, before the Eurozone crisis, before the global financial crisis, maybe even before 9/11. So that normal was more than 20 years ago. And this is actually really consistent with what cognitive and behavioral experts tell us. If you've ever read Hans Rosling's Factfulness, you'll know that he has a quiz at the front. This is one of my favorite books, highly recommended. But what the quiz is about, and what it highlights, is that most of us are actually carrying around ideas based on stereotypes that are really out of date. Now, you all look a bit scared. I'm going to stay with me because I'm going to scare you a little bit longer, and then we're going to talk about what it means, and we're going to discuss it. So, because I got the same question over and over again, even though I had patiently explained to these boards that things were changing, and here's the data, and here's the trend line, and I said, well, when's it going to stop? We undertook some empirical research. That means with numbers. In political science, this is not easy because whilst we have a database for looking at interest rate hikes and currency fluctuations, we don't have a database for geopolitics because what does it mean? It means all kinds of things. If I gave you the definition about cross-border moves, it means cross-border conflicts, could mean refugee flows and disruptions. It means tariffs and sanctions. It's espionage. How do you count that? How do you track that? The things that are done below radar, these so-called gray zone attacks. These are all examples of how states use geopolitical means to, increase their competitive advantage and or undermine their adversaries. It's happening all the time, and it always has. What we did was to construct a database, this is manual, using open sources. The paper is publicly available, but the short explanation here is that between 2010, so the second half of the global financial crisis, and 2024, so before you-know-who returned to the White House, we saw a tripling in the risks that we tracked, the ones where there was available data across a large set of countries. That's what's difficult about this exercise. So, what does this tell us? Isn't all Trump's fault. If you were inclined to believe that, Americans take umbrage at that. Europeans don't. That's why I put it that way. But even before Trump 2.0, 10 times increase in trade disputes. Why? Because no one likes wars, people are killed, and it became very fashionable, even during sort of peak liberal institutionalism, as it was called, to pass sanctions as a way of imposing costs on countries for bad behavior. So this going back to normal, again, it means really going back a long time ago, and we are seeing more conflicts. But it isn't all because of Trump, and that also means it isn't all going to go away if Trump doesn't remain in office. How many people watched Carney's speech at Davos? It was one of the great speeches, I think, of our time. And if you didn't watch it, it's not too late. He wrote it himself. Watch it with your kids, if you have kids. Very powerful. And I'm always impressed with somebody who would include quotes from Václav Havel, the former Czech Prime Minister, the late Czech Prime Minister and playwright. But Carney's words were very carefully chosen because there is no corporation that would allow any of us to say rupture. You'd have to say something like an evolution, a reset, a little tiny tweak, to the way that we've been doing things. Carney said rupture and not a transition. And everywhere I go, people have been using this terminology, except America. They probably didn't watch it. So it was a zeitgeist moment, I suppose. That's what I'm trying to get across, this notion. And it has kind of set the tone for 2026. Now, rupture sounds dramatic, and it is, doesn't mean that it doesn't also trigger some positive developments, right? I mean, I don't think any of us would say that everything was perfect before. It's just that change and uncertainty is unsettling. So this is the what did we do bit. I use the term zeitgeist. This is one of my favorite words, German word meaning spirit of the times. And what I'm referring to here is a Harvard Business Review study from about 15 years ago, which is really worth having a look at, since I'm here with business school students. And what this study did was look at the most successful CEOs of all time, as they put it. What did they do? What did they have in common? Well, it wasn't that they presided over the biggest profits, and it wasn't that they released that company's best invention. What this HBS study revealed was that these leaders had navigated the challenges of their times, best of all, basically what was thrown at them. And I think that's useful inspiration for all of us as we're trying to navigate this complexity in this environment, as long as we are forward-looking and not backward-looking. When the German embassy in London said to me after the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine that we were waiting for the dust to settle, I got really worried, right? That was not the kind of answer that you want to hear, especially, you know, in whether you are a private sector leader or a public sector leader. As leaders, we can set the tone in the way that we talk to our teams, our talent, and everybody else, managing the challenges of the time. I have a term I call PQ. I would have called it GQ, Geopolitical Quotient, but there's a men's magazine by that name, which was unfortunate because I still would prefer that. But your political quotient as a person or as in an organization will help you. You've been told you need to be more empathetic. Fine, be empathetic. I think you need PQ. I think we need to be assessing the global environment and where we fit into it. That's not something that we ever had to do before. We could live in our bubbles. I do see it, though, as a kind of a superpower, a big advantage. And where I see that superpower most present might surprise you. I see it in people who are immigrants or bicultural, right? Parents from a different country growing up in a third country, people who've lived in different contexts, because what you do when you've grown up that way is you have an ability to read the room wherever you are, right? It doesn't matter if it's from a class perspective or a nationality or something else. You are always scanning the horizon. And when I talk to Argentine CEOs, they say inflation, schmation, we've dealt with this. We can deal with it. But if you haven't had experience of managing through crisis or complexity, of course it feels very disconcerting. So, New World Order or no world order? I am asked all the time if we're moving to some kind of 19th century spheres of influence. And my view there is only in Donald Trump's dreams. Is there the Donroe Doctrine, his recasting of the 19th century Monroe Doctrine, which asserted U.S. primacy in the Latin American hemisphere. Why? It's worth remembering, because James Monroe wanted to prevent Spain, Portugal, and other European colonial powers coming back to their former colonies. That was the context there. But whether it's the Panama Canal or Greenland, that poorly managed chunk of ice, I think Trump called it, or the Strait of Hormuz, These are all economic choke points, strategic control of resources, and this is what geopolitics means right now. You could argue, history rhymes, of course. It's 1956, it's Suez. There are certainly echoes of the past there, but this competition for resources, to me, is not about spheres of influence and carving up into a tripartite world. It's something much more assertive, which I think is a challenge for us in Europe, and an opportunity, right? But we can't be passive, I think, about the way we react. Opportunistic alliances, that's one thing that we can track. Have a look at which world leaders are getting on a plane to go to China and see Xi Jinping. That's a very good tracker of the kind of mood, if you like, of world leaders. Another one is, why did Mark Carney travel 11 hours last week to attend the European Council Summit in Yerevan, Armenia? Right? I mean, it's not loose talk now that Canada talks about joining the EU. Canada won't join the EU, but Canada's certainly getting closer to the European Union. That's the kind of next stage of this new world order. Well, what happens to the countries that are not the United States, China, Russia, Iran, or North Korea? What happens to us? What do we decide to do in this moment? What are our competitive advantages? So I talked to a lot of lawyers, and they're very concerned with this. Although luckily for lawyers, they make money no matter what happens. Because if alliances collapse and deals, this competitive deregulation and demergers and everything else, lawyers are still busy taking care of that. But an interregnum in the global operating system, I think, describes pretty well where we find ourselves. We are in between. We are in between where we were before, with peak globalization, global institutions, supranational institutions like the EU, governance, rule of law, and then these two terms that was it the Irish ambassador to Singapore? She used these. Does everyone feel comfortable that they know what is meant by sovereignty and autonomy in the policy sense? She also used the expression reducing dependence. These terms are all over EU policy now. What they mean is reducing dependence on the United States. Now, originally, they were conceived to talk about China and concerns about Chinese espionage activities and Huawei and all kinds of other things. This same language and set of policies is now being used to talk about American companies, technology, Ireland, and defense. We are just beginning to see how this trend will evolve. On the other side, we have the US exorbitant privilege. The Chinese foreign minister 2 weeks ago, twice, used this expression, law of the jungle. He didn't name names. He didn't talk about America, so I don't want to put words in his mouth. But as much as China is a superpower and in fact sees itself by many indicators as more powerful than the United States, it doesn't like the law of the jungle either. What it wants is to recreate international institutions to be more sympathetic to China, as they have been post-World War II, post-Bretton Woods, to the victors of World War II. That is what is driving behavior, and that's what geopolitics is. These countries are all trying to rearrange the international system to give themselves more advantages. Companies understand this. We just haven't really experienced it at the global level for a long time. So in response, supply chains are getting rewired. I had an hour-long call yesterday with the geopolitical strategy team at McKinsey, who were asking me, what I thought they should do to help companies who are mainly going to McKinsey, who's always been there to do entry strategy, exit strategy, and everything else, change their supply chains to reduce these risks, to reduce these dependencies where choke points may be blocked. This is having a huge impact, and I would argue represents a big opportunity for Europe and other hubs that are nearer to kind of major markets. So for companies, this is a business school, you have MBAs, you were educated and grew up in a time where the focus, of course, was on balance sheet, on optimization. What's your optimization set? Jamie Dimon said a couple of weeks ago, in the kind of Jamie Dimon sort of way, we all moved everything to China to save $10 on the wire, right? And that's what optimization meant. And it made some countries rich. It created all kinds of distortions, if you like. But we're not in an optimization era anymore, nor are we in a frictionless world. Now, I spoke to an ultra high net worth conference last week, and they did not like that idea of frictionless, because for the super wealthy and all of the institutions that have grown up around them, it's all about optimization all the time, being able to move seamlessly across jurisdictions, across, borders. But the war in Iran has been a reminder of how difficult that is. So how do companies react? They might not say that they are looking through a geopolitics lens. Whether or not they say that, though, they are. They now understand they need to look at national interest, the reducing dependencies idea, stability and reliability. Again, I do think that that is an advantage for us in boring old Europe. For as much as we like to complain about our elected officials, and who knows by the time I land back in London tonight whether Keir Starmer will still be in office, or will the moving van will have rolled up to number 10 and taken him away. I wish we could do that in America, just get them out straight away. This is instability of a sort. Certainly the gilt market won't like it. It's the 5th Prime Minister in the UK for a long time. But it's still boring, stable Europe in many ways. So in my work with companies, and especially with boards, the kind of concrete exercises that I do when I get people in a room, it's about refuting, really, that signal and noise idea. That works for markets, financial market signals. It doesn't work for geopolitics. By the time we get a signal, for example, about China-Taiwan, it's going to be too late for you to hedge. So thinking about plausible hypotheticals, meaning material probability events. This is, again, where corporate accounting, corporate finance methods are useless because of that 0 and 1 phenomenon. 20% probability events happen in life all the time, but not on our balance sheet because we don't have any way of accounting for them. When I work with companies, I come up with a list, some kind of, semi-whimsical, but all of them material probability. And I did this in December with a group of Japanese insurers. And I said, Maduro exit, Greenland annexation, Iran regime change in December. And they said, that's ridiculous, none of those things will happen. And by February, of course, those 3 and many of the others had become more reasonable material probability events. If you do this with your board on your chosen list of things, it's a really excellent exercise for people to stop and say, that would never happen. Are we sure that would never happen? Why are we sure that would? What would we do if it did happen? This is a very low-tech way to start addressing those cognitive biases that I mentioned, right? Who holds the cards? Now an excellent shorthand for trying to assess that power dynamic. Of course, it is, I've taken it from that infamous Oval Office episode with Vladimir Zelensky, J.D. Vance saying you haven't said thank you, and Donald Trump saying you don't hold any cards. Of course, it's another conversation about how 15 months later, Ukraine does appear to hold a lot of cards, but this notion of who thinks they hold the cards, who actually holds the cards, and how they negotiate is not just something that happens during an M&A transaction. It's now happening in global affairs. Now, I reckon Xi Jinping is going to be entertaining President Trump this week, humoring him, letting him believe Trump that he holds the cards, giving him a bunch of goodies like soybean, purchases and things like this, and all the while playing him. Now, are you all still with me? Are there drinks after this? We may need them. A little bit on the war in Iran, and I do want to get to your questions. We told our clients in the first week that it wasn't going to be like the June 2025 attacks on Iran's nuclear facilities. Long story short, the White House is now really trapped. Who could have seen it coming, apart from everybody who knows something about Iran? Well, except that the consequences of this strategic failure are going to be with us for some time. Now, Iran has been a very awkward country in the global system for 47 years, and they have been working to build a nuclear deterrent. But not only has Iran just learned, but so has every other country which is not a superpower but wants to increase its deterrence and its negotiating position, that commandeering a global economic choke point is way better than having a nuclear weapon. And nobody died, at least there. So a big lesson has been learned. The US response, yes, but I mean, they didn't have to attack with a nuclear weapon, is what I'm saying. They've been able to hold the global economy and the United States to ransom by charging a toll. Iran is now getting millions every day in crypto for allowing selective passage. So they can hold out even longer. And every other country is thinking, how can I monetize my choke point? So we've seen a shift in the strategic reality with this Iran war, even though, my kind of official view is I don't believe the United States wants to put boots on the ground. Iran doesn't want to be in that situation either, but they think they hold the cards, meaning they think they can last longer. And they are willing to make more sacrifices in terms of their own people and everything else. That's what it means to engage in a negotiation. We probably are going to be in some kind of frozen conflict with, periodic threats. For those of you who like to make bets on the energy market on a Sunday night ahead of a Monday morning, but it is stalled. It's a stalemate, and the Strait of Malacca are now saying maybe we should charge a toll also. Vox Populi, voice of the people. You can actually anticipate quite a bit just by looking ahead at the election calendar every year. Because politicians, that's what they do. They look ahead to an election, then they work backward and try to figure out how much they can accomplish. So US elections in November are, obviously a big kind of, bookend for whatever the United States can do. Congress will go into recess in June, don't forget. Israeli elections in October are another signpost for Israel. We haven't got a lot of big European countries voting this year, which is kind of merciful. And then the rest are opportunities to kind of take the temperature, if you like. Who shows up where? A bit of Kremlinology. Who's going to be at the G20 in the United States? Who's going to be on the non-invited list? But the US midterms are the big one. Before we get there, I noticed 2 weeks ago a shift in the public opinion data about the United States, where for the first time, and I don't know offhand how many countries were surveyed here, but there was a Gallup survey and there was a Politico poll of polls survey, so two, looking at kind of historic US allies and how they're trust in the United States, who is it better to depend on, had declined. Even the UK, with a special relationship, such as it is, trusts China by 42% more than the United States. And Canada, they are really cross. They are not interested in becoming the cherished 51st state. But not only that, they are reforming internally, right? So this spat with the United States managed to accomplish something that, frankly, Canada should have done a long time ago, which was kind of reduce its internal trade barriers to do more trade within Canada, and have got Mark Carney on that plane, doing more with Europe, with India, and he's visited China too. So that is where the practical implications of these shifts in trust are ending up. What's going to happen in America? Well, we have still many months to go. I want to show this kind of pair of statistics because while it's true that President Trump has the lowest approval rating of any president at this stage of his term, I mean, Keir Starmer or Emmanuel Macron would dream of having a 36% approval rating. And he has a hard core of support, which really hasn't wavered much. He has lost the support of the coalition that brought him into power, some elements of the coalition that brought him into power, and that's significant, you know, Hispanic men and others. But guess who is even less popular than Donald Trump? The Democrats. 28%. They are underwater, right? If you can't kind of mount a response in this environment as the opposition party, when can you? And yet Democrats really haven't emerged from the 2026 elections, the 2024 elections with an offering. They're still digesting what happened and what to do about it. Democrats are still thinking about putting Kamala Harris forward again. So incumbents have an advantage unless the opposition can come up, you know, with a really compelling alternative. It's you know, I wouldn't go so far as to say that Republicans will win again in the next presidential elections. That's just too far away from now. And Democrats are likely to win the House. They are in a reasonable position to maybe take the Senate. As you all probably know, it comes down to 6 battleground states. So that's what I'm tracking, those 6 states. But it's not as clear-cut as you might think. And remember that if the Democrats do manage to pull off a blue wave, this is going to be very worrisome for the White House because they'll be able to move again to impeach, which they haven't talked about. There's been a party taboo about that, and potentially to remove the president. And if Democrats win in 2028, people are going to jail. Remember that as you think about this will all go away. There's a vested interest in the incumbent party to stay in power. That's always the case. Sounds like you've had a very thorough discussion of AI. Continuing on the US theme, it wasn't my observation, but I really liked the observation that the only bipartisan area of support in America is opposition to data centers. I thought that was quite interesting because, of course, America has big open spaces where these could be built. A lot of the clients that I'm talking to are part of this, and they are, they are almost united in being a magnet for local opposition. So that's something that I'm going to be watching because it's also an opportunity for political parties to kind of stake out a view. So a few concluding thoughts, and then some questions. After a very long period where geopolitics was kind of a lightning rod for risk, it's also now an investment theme, whether that's the European security and rearmament trade, which is a major boost to growth for Europe, metals in mining, industrials, commodities, etc. Uncertainty is also driving consolidation. This is going to be a huge year for M&A activity and for more competition. Companies aren't going to wait for the dust to settle, at least the big ones that have the first mover advantage. And number 3 is where I think Ireland and that kind of middle powers set of countries have an advantage that they could seek to strengthen, which is that kind of relative stability and predictability. We're just used to it, so perhaps we don't see it as an advantage. But I can say anecdotally that after the developments of the last year, a lot of American and Asian and Middle Eastern investors started to come shopping in Europe, because there are good companies here and there are good opportunities. But very often in business we like to focus on the shiny thing, and maybe don't look as carefully at things. So that's what I have to say there. Final quote: "Fortune favors the brave, always be brave. Chance favors the prepared mind." This is my message to the ostrich, bury the head in the sand people. If you don't engage with this range of plausible hypotheticals, with the things that might happen, upside and downside, you won't recognize the opportunity, because you are stuck in expecting things to be the way they've always been. So you won't say, "Oh, that's different. That could be good for us." It's my book. It's coming out in September. Got to push out the deadline a little bit. War in Iran. Is the world getting better or worse? And I have a free newsletter if you want to keep up with things. I've probably talked way too long. Did I talk about my notes? So we have microphones. Does everybody want to run away? Where are the microphones, and do we have... the Dean. Dean, come. You're supposed to come and be a respondent, wrap it all up. This whole day of stimulating discussion.
Well, I certainly have to say that has been a very, very thought-provoking presentation. Perhaps ask you a question.
Oh, you're supposed to make an observation. You're supposed to say, what does it mean for UCD and Ireland, all of this?
Well, one thing that struck me, certainly coming out from the presentation, was the issue of resiliency, right? And also the issue of leverage. And it certainly seems to me that something we're seeing in the world at the moment is that scale and money doesn't necessarily give you leverage anymore.
Might doesn't always make right. This is a really, I completely agree.
And we're seeing then people realizing that they have leverage in different ways. It could be leverage over access to some commodity. It could be leverage in terms of access or control over, say, the Straits of Hormuz or whatever. The other thing that strikes me as well is that in this sort of game of sort of economic nationalism, there is certainly an advantage for authoritarian regimes over democratic regimes.
For a time, yes. But look at Orban.
I'd be interested for your take on that, because if you want to make some big bets in terms of this is the way we see the world going and we are going to double down on some sector or some particular industry, an authoritarian regime can do that, not worried about the effects on employment or individuals. Democratic regime finds it harder to do that. So if you take these two things together, states looking for leverage, but that being easier to do if you're in an authoritarian regime, I'd be just interested for your take on how you see those type of forces playing out.
Well, you're asking that question of a political scientist, so I would
for the lesser
yes.
lesser amongst us, not political scientists.
So I just bought a book, and the title is "Strong Men Don't Always Get What They Want." Right? So I was intrigued by that, because I'm really interested when things don't go down that might makes right path. Because when Russia invaded Ukraine, all kinds of people, not just in my world, in the kind of international affairs, forecasting world, but business leaders said Ukraine is toast, they're going to be done. The Russian army reportedly brought its dress uniforms because they were going to have a victory parade in Kiev and everything else. And, I don't want to say fast forward because it's 4 very long, bloody years, but where we find ourselves now, where Ukraine has become probably the military power in Europe with drone technology, even if, as that kind of famous gaffe from the Rheinmetall CEO a few weeks ago, he said, well, it's just housewives at the kitchen table. Well, they're doing it, right? And Putin practically had to cancel his Victory Day parade. Again, watch the clip from Saturday. It took place under drone netting. They couldn't have, I lived in Russia for years, they couldn't have the tanks on Red Square. Putin had to ask Trump to intervene. Zelensky, who is a brilliant troll, wrote a memo on X that said, I hereby grant you permission for 3 days for your victory parade. And then he put the GPS coordinates of Red Square. And a couple of days before, if this is a surprise to you, by the way, you're not paying attention. This is all very much available in the public domain. They attacked within 6 kilometers of Moscow, and steadily, because there have been so many other things in the world that have distracted us, Ukraine has been undermining Russian energy infrastructure. About 30% is gone. So the tables have turned, in other words. It turned out that Russia was not the second most powerful military in Europe. And likewise, in Iran, I just explained, no one expected Iran to close the Strait of Hormuz. I have been part of wargaming exercises for 20 years looking at this. No one thought they would do it. I was with an energy CEO, the Total Energy CEO. He said, we've wargamed this for 20 years and we didn't think it would happen, right? That illustrates my point precisely about how if you don't think through how these, not low probability, but material probability events can happen, you're going to be surprised every time. Total certainly was. So, power, I've explained that geopolitics is about power, but it isn't always concentrated in the hands of superpowers, which is why I think we all need to think about power. Even an agency in our lives, everyone feels better when they use their agency. You will need to identify yourself, if you don't mind. And no heckling.
Sorry. Hi, Andrew McKeown from Imperial College. Just adding on to Tony's Tony's question.
Yeah.
How does that play out with China?
So you know about the history of empire, right? They can go on for a long time. And this is what's difficult when we look at things through a corporate lens on a kind of a quarterly basis. We know that Xi Jinping has consolidated power in a way that no other Chinese leader has for some time. We also know that it's very opaque, and we're just not getting much news or information. We know the data aren't reliable. So that's why I returned to what I suggested about who holds the cards and who thinks they hold the cards. Because I think that is maybe our most reliable, angle for making this judgment. China is negotiating as though it thinks it holds the cards, whether that's battery technology, critical minerals, and everything else. We in Europe have, I think, been guilty of thinking that we could just regulate our way out of having to be stuck in this great power competition, and we're now playing catch-up. Although I do think we have many advantages. Hard power hasn't really been among them, but that is changing. Can the United States meaningfully challenge? I mean, China and the United States, they don't want to go to war with each other. We're not in the frenemies era either. We are in a great power competition, mainly through economic means, but not only. So are we going to wake up one day and find that China has reunified with Taiwan? It'll probably be more salami tactics, little bits at a time, the small islands and other things, more military exercises. But the reason why NATO matters, and I'm aware this is a controversial, sensitive topic in Ireland, but I'm going to say it anyway, but the reason why NATO matters and the US security treaty allies relationship with South Korea and Japan and Taiwan, Australia, Five Eyes and all of this, is because we are looking now at countries that are willing to exploit loopholes and look for weaknesses. So we're about to find out if sovereign borders are going to be redrawn, or if the countries that might have the power to do that decide not to. And here again is where I would argue that deterrence is valuable, that it's worth investing in defense, and it's worth maybe being louder, if I can say that, and more assertive about what we stand for.
So one final question.
Feel free to make an observation also. I mean, I hope I haven't given you the impression that I have all the answers. I'm very fond of posing questions to other people. Yes, please.
Hi, my name's Adrienne Murphy. I am wondering what your thoughts are on Ireland. We obviously have a lot of global comms infrastructure coming through Ireland, a high concentration of data centres, and there's a lot of increased Russian activity around Irish waters. Yep. And I'm wondering what you're thinking about, like what Ireland should be doing. There's a lot of debate about defence spending, and also what should Europe be thinking about, because Ireland it's quite vulnerable, it could be a bit of an Achilles heel, and if something happens there, it affects the globe, essentially.
I mean, it's the right question to ask, but my policy is not to provide unsolicited advice to the host country that I'm invited to visit. I was thinking about the remarks made at the beginning, and I don't want to sound like I'm avoiding the question, but a lot of things can be true at the same time, right? The Irish advantage can be true. The fact that kind of Ireland as a brand, really is powerful. And the US can be hostile to Europe, but be a little bit nicer to Ireland, right? We have to keep all of these semi-conflicting facts with us at one time, which is hard for most people, because we would much prefer to have kind of one baseline view that says this has worked well for us and so we should stick with it. My sense would be keep the things that have worked well, but strengthen where there are weaknesses. And that does mean, just as Mark Carney is flying all over making new friends, I think that it means shoring up defenses. And there are a lot of different ways of doing that, of course. As I say, I'm very aware of the sensitivities, but, we're off in the Atlantic here. You've got Spain, which is a NATO member state and a non-payer, and we're no longer in that era of Pax Americana and that post-Cold War peace dividend. And so, would you say that conversation is happening here at the national level? I don't think it is. I think we're arguing about other things quite a bit more. And this is true everywhere, I would say, where the kind of, the national level political conversation tends to be about what's in front of people, or maybe even culture wars and other things, rather than the big strategic considerations. How do we invest in infrastructure and competitiveness and research and development when we have aging populations? Those are hard conversations to have. Politicians don't like to have them, and people don't either. But I guess I'm trying to encourage everybody to start having them yourselves, at your dinner table and in your boardrooms, because of that idea of mental preparedness, which is mainly about imagining a future beyond the continuation of what you've got used to.
With that, I'm going to bring proceedings to a close. I'd like to say a big thank you to Tina for a very, very provocative...
Thanks, and don't ever come back again. Thank you. Can I say one more thing? No, I've put my mic back on. I forgot to say that if you are a LinkedIn person, or even if you're not, you should become one, because networks. I said that was good. If there was anything you wanted to say or ask me about, but were too shy, please connect on LinkedIn, and I do respond, unless you're mean to me, in which case I block you. That actually doesn't happen very often. Only Americans are mean. Thank you.
And I think that is a very, very good moment for us to adjourn for the evening and retire to the common room for some refreshments.